Thanks very much. Today I want to start off with an example of the diversity of LGBTI experience in Indonesia. I'm going to take an example of a people called the Bugis people from Sulawesi. They recognise 5 genders, and the best way to think about these 5 genders is like a pyramid. At the very base you have male and female, and so we could say that the bottom of the pyramid, if you like. Moving up, then you have chalalai, which are ladies, or women I should say, let's say that they physically would appear to be women, but they dress as men and and act as men too, and take girlfriends. On the other side, you have chalabai, which is basically the reverse. This is guys, anatomically males, who dress as women and take male lovers. At the very top, and this is very important, is bisu. Bisu is a kind of priest who is a connection between the hereafter, the unseen world, the supernatural, and the everyday world. So if you like, at the very apex, the highest form of sexuality amongst these people is intersex. And why I'm bringing this example up is to discuss the way sexual patterns, gender identities such as these are coming under pressure in recent years. And I've got one big idea today, and that is the global ideas and activism associated with LGBTI has helped, but also hindered a lot of the kinds of practices that I'm talking about. And I'll use the term homonormativity. Homonormativity can get in the way of understanding and interacting with people of different gender and sexual identities. So I'm going to start today with a case, if I can find the letter, of a High Court judge called Hidayat. He's just been elected to the Constitutional Court in Indonesia. Now, before he was elected, he was asked by a delegation of parliamentarians, what do you think of same-sex marriage in Indonesia? His response, we cannot recognise it. That kind of thing, he said, might be appropriate for America, but it won't work here in Indonesia. Now, what is appealing to here is a kind of global discourse of nationalism that's kind of passé for many of us, but was very widespread, let's say 50 to 100 years ago, especially in the period when Indonesia was becoming a sovereign nation. And the idea here is that homosexuality, other things like drugs, pornography, etc., are Western or US phenomena which have corrupted Indonesia. So that was his response. Now, it attracted a lot of attention, particularly an LGBTI activist. He's by the name of Hartoyo. Now, Hartoyo was working in Aceh after the tsunami with an LGBTI activist group. He was living with his partner, same-sex attracted partner, and was detained, beaten and tortured by local police. He wrote a letter to that judge. The judge's name is Mr. Hidayat. Mr. Hidayat, I have never experienced loving a woman. As far as my experience goes, my love is only for men. Mr. Hidayat, I have never visited any Western countries, but I was attracted to men even before I really understood what Indonesia was and what Islam was. Mr. Hidayat, you consider same-sex marriage to be Western culture, contrary to the Indonesian constitution, but why, could you explain, is the issue of same-sex marriage still being debated in France and the USA? Will those who reject same-sex marriage in the West then say that homosexuality is a product of the East, of the South, of the North? The fact is that when Western countries were criminalising same-sex love, our archipelago was celebrating the plurality of sexuality in our cultures. For example, we can cite the traditional plurality of sexuality here, such as the cultures of Bisu, which I just mentioned. Warok is a East Javanese tradition. It's a male dance troupe leader who doesn't want to be contaminated by women. So he'll take a younger, effeminate male to be his wife. Waro, Gumblak's the name of the younger effeminate male, and the Ma'iril. And Ma'iril is just a tradition in Indonesian Islamic boarding schools for same-sex attracted males to sleep together, and so on. There are many cultures that have a place in Indonesia for same-sex partnerships. Mr. Hidayat, homosexuals, and I should say the term homosexual and gay is still the preferred term in Indonesia. Homosexuals are around us. Like it or not, this is a fact that has been true since long ago and is true today. They might be the closest to us, our children, our siblings, our grandchildren, or our best friends. But sometimes we have no empathy for this issue. They are not people who have invaded from the West, but rather they are part of us. So this is the response of the LGBTI activist to the High Court judge's idea. Now, what he's appealing to here, interestingly, is a global kind of discourse again. Even though it's placed in Indonesia, it's a global kind of discourse. This idea of a sort of wealth of exotic ritual and dance is a very common idea, and I have to say, as an anthropologist, we were, 30 or 40 years ago, part of a tradition, of a sort of scholarly tradition which focused on this. So it's part of this idea of a wealth of ritual and dance. But also what he's appealing to is a very interesting idea, which is that, according to a guy called Tom Bullstorff, that in Indonesia, to be gay, and this is the term, of course, gay, first of all, is to be national. Their understanding, particularly amongst urban, more well-educated, same-sex attracted people, is that because of this sort of wealth, this diversity of sexual identities and practices, that because of that, it's uniquely Indonesian. So what, in fact, the word, part of the movement in Indonesia is called gaya. Gaya means something like style. And in the understanding of same-sex attracted people and LGBTI in Indonesia, gaya is actually linked to the English word gay. The idea of style and gay goes together. So this isn't a connection that Western linguists would make, but it's certainly a meaningful connection for people in Indonesia. Okay, the story gets even more interesting here. So we've had the constitutional judge, the response of the activist. Along comes an ulama, basically an Islamic scholar and leader. He's been trained in Australia, and he's a member of the sort of, if I said Supreme Council, it would be exaggerating, but a high council of ulama in Indonesia. His name's Budiatman. His email response, the gayness of Hartoyo could be caused by the fact that when your parents were, please excuse me, copulating and faked dictated that the seed became you, it was highly possible that at that moment Satan entered because your parents forgot to pray, or at least say, in the name of Allah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm sorry, but this implies it's naturally a matter for the unseen world. So here we have another response to this issue, and what we have is an idea that gayness, again the Indonesian idea of gayness, contradicts religion. And this of course is a common theme. It's not just in Indonesia, and nothing particularly to do with Islam. We'll get this in a whole range of religions. So we've got different strategies for dealing with this diversity. On the one hand, we have this idea, if we start off with the judge's idea, that homosexuality, as he calls it, is a Western American phenomenon. Another idea that it's part of the wealth of ritual and tradition that makes Indonesia Indonesian, and that makes gay people first and foremost Indonesian. And finally, another idea that gayness, again, contradicts religion. So different, if you're what you could call discursive strategies, that's just a pretentious way of saying ways of understanding or reconciling this diversity. Now what's interesting about all of them is that even though they are applied to a specific local or national phenomenon, is that they draw on a global style of argumentation, a global discourse, if you like. But what we find as anthropologists, and what we're very interested in right now, is a mismatch between these global ideas, whether opposed to LGBTI or supporting LGBTI, a mismatch between these ideas and local practices. In other words, global academic and activist ideals anthropologists are saying, are not appropriately discussing local issues. I'll give you an example which isn't great, which is from Padang, a city in northwest Sumatra. Here there are people called tomboy from the English tomboy. These are women with female genitalia. They identify as women, which is a bit different from some other countries, act like a man and love women. And the kind of women they love are called feminine. So often the feminine women actually go on and then marry a heterosexual man and have a family. But the tomboy tend to stay removed from this world. Now, in a recent academic account of what's going on in Padang, the scholar describes how an activist from Jakarta comes. She identifies as lesbian. She says, I'm not masculine, I'm not feminine, I'm basically a woman who loves a woman. Now, for the tomboy in Padang, this kind of idea didn't match with their experience. For them, if you were same-sex relationships between women had to be gendered in terms of male and female. So in a sense, what you have is a breakdown between activism and ideas from the capital city and actual practices in a local area. So how do we understand this breakdown? And this gets to larger issues which aren't particularly associated with Pride Week, but larger issues about contemporary world. We could look at it as a kind of intersection between global and local discourse. In a sense, there's a global, if you like, LGBTI discourse, which has been appropriated by people who support LGBTI and also the opponents of LGBTI. And what I mean by this is that prior to colonialism, prior to the arrival of the Dutch colonisers in Indonesia, and similarly in other parts of Southeast Asia, prior to the arrival of colonialism, there was a large diversity of sexual practices, not so much identities. In other words, there would be same-sex, or what we would call same-sex or transgender practices, but they wouldn't typically be associated with an identity. After colonialism, after the advent of modernity, these global discourses of gay and subsequently LGBTI have sort of worked to segment out a part of the population which opens them to stigmatisation, but at the same time provides them with tools to fight back. So it's an interesting contradiction. It's helping and it's hindering. So it creates a problem, but also a means to solve it. More recently, another approach to try and understand this is to try and get away from this global-local distinction, saying, well, this isn't really working anymore. We've gone even past that. It's more a case now of transnationalism. So what we thought of as global is a product of local traditions, and what we thought of as local is a product of the global. In other words, the global-local breaks down, and what we really have now is transnationalism. And an example of this is the final instalment of the story of the judge who was opposed to same-sex marriage. Because an openly gay judge from the US emailed the judge and urged him to respond to the activist, to respond to the LGBTI activist. And the judge did. He wrote to the activist and he said, well, I didn't mean any harm, but he said constitutionally marriage must be between man and woman, the sort of thing we're used to. But interestingly, he also said you and your community should be protected from violent acts, which for Indonesia in the contemporary situation was quite a big step. So what this shows, I think, is that sexuality is conducted on local stages, national stages, and international stages, and it's in ways that sometimes help people we could identify as LGBTI, but also hinder them. Thanks very much.